Okay, hello everyone. So welcome to our webinar on introducing the Resilient Recovery Framework. My name is Mike Moffett. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Innovation here at Smart Prosperity. And I'm joined by John McNally, one of my research associates here. And we're going to work through what this Resilient Recovery Framework is, why it's needed, and how it can help policymakers and policy thinkers think through the policies that are going to need Canada's going to need to recover from this current situation. So what we've done here is this is something that we've created and submitted to the Task Force for Resilient Recovery. So if you would like to learn more about the task force, we have two URLs down in here. There's an English website and a French website. But basically what the task force is it's a number of Canada's leading business leaders, policy leaders, leaders from other sectors of Canadian society have all come together to provide advice to governments on what is needed to recover the Canadian economy through this crisis. So we're going to talk about the framework that we put together for this. The framework is actually, the full framework is available at the URLs below. It's a 26-page guide that's very comprehensive, goes through what policymakers should be thinking about and how they can assess policy proposals. So the Resilient Recovery Framework is a comprehensive tool for policymakers to optimize proposals on three broad dimensions. So there's an economic dimension, which considers the short run stimulus, but also long run growth and competitiveness. There's an environmental component to this. Do the policy proposals help the environment and support clean competitiveness? And then there's a third tranche of questions or areas around, can you actually implement these ideas? Are they feasible? And are they equitable? Do they help marginalized and vulnerable Canadian communities? So the idea behind this framework, you can use this framework in a number of ways. The obvious way would be to just say, okay, this is a good policy proposal and this is a bad policy proposal, and rank order them. But we think it's actually more valuable than that, or more useful than that you can actually use this framework to be able to take a good policy idea, run it through the framework, see where it might be lacking, and tweak it. So basically turn a good policy idea into a great policy idea. So the motivation behind it, why is this needed at all? Why does Canada need a resilient recovery? Well, currently we're in, what many are calling the sort of great lockdown, where we basically, policymakers have put the economy into a medically induced coma. In the March labor force survey, we saw there was an employment drop of 1 million Canadians. That was at the time the largest drop in recorded history. And in fact, like entire recessions in the past, we haven't seen a drop of 1 million people, let alone in a single month. In April, we saw an employment drop of 2 million Canadians. So that was twice as large. So that became the new record. And no one knows how bad this will get. And if we look at other data sources other than the labor force survey, people who are applying for the wage subsidies and so on, it looks like this is going to continue to get worse before it gets better. And job loss doesn't actually just capture all of this, because we're seeing other people who are technically employed but not working any hours, or people who were working full-time now working part-time, people working from home but aren't as productive, because they're also having to look after kids. You may end up hearing mine in the background. So, just looking at these job numbers are dramatic, but don't even capture the full picture. Trevor Tombe, a economist at University of Calgary, made this nice little graph here showing the reduction in hours worked between February and April across the economy. So this captures not only people who have not worked entirely, but reduced hours. And generally speaking, over the last 3 months, Canadians are working on average 30% less than they were back in February. And this is somewhat unevenly spread across the country. So again, this has very large economic consequences. And this is very different than a typical recession. Like clockwork, like the last three recessions we've had, the last three major recessions that we've had, the one in the early 80s, the one in the early 90s, and the one coming in the financial crisis, were almost identical. In those recessions, job loss was experienced 80% by men, 880. And it wasn't just because men make up a larger portion of the workforce, which they do. Right now it's about they're 54% of the workforce, but it's the type of jobs that are lost during a recession. Now we have a situation more women than men are losing their jobs. So you may have heard in the media this idea of a she-cession. And the thing is behind this is, historically women have experienced about 18 to 21% of the job loss. Now it's over 50%. So their proportion has more than doubled during this crisis. Well, the big reason for that is, again, the type of workers that are losing their jobs. Historically, going back to the last three recessions, the types of industries that were the most cyclical, most affected by the business cycle, tended to be manufacturing and construction. And not surprisingly, the proportion of men who work in that industry is about 80%. So the last recession, over half of the net job loss was in manufacturing and construction workers. Right now, it's less than 20%. And obviously, and we'll talk about this, obviously this proportion is going to change over time, but it's probably not going to get up to those levels. Because if we look at the last recession, who lost their jobs? It was middle-aged workers. It tended to be older workers, from places like St. Thomas and Chicoutimi, auto workers, welders, again, very male positions. But now, if we're looking at the people who are losing their jobs during this crisis, it's a lot different. It tends to be service workers. It's more likely women, and it's more likely younger workers. It's also more likely urban workers. The largest job losses in the economy have been places like Vancouver and Toronto because they have a higher proportion of service workers. This is a very urban recession, much more than once in the past that had tended to hit mid-sized cities and smaller towns harder. So right now, the government's done all kinds of things. Both the federal and provincial government have done all kinds of things, but they've been focused on disaster relief. Eventually, they're going to have to think through what policies around the recovery are going to be. And frankly, we don't even know when the recovery is going to start. Policymakers are thinking of the certain current crisis in three stages. That again, we have the sort of medically induced coma stage, the emergency stage, a restart stage. And restart's a bit of a misnomer. John and I have a op-ed that's coming out shortly on this that, we think it's a wrong analogy. It's more of a mountain climb where there's going to be a lot of peaks and valleys, and it's going to take a long time to reboot the economy. So it's going to take a while. And then once we, that mountain climb, once that is over, we're still going to need to recover the economy. There's still going to be a lot of lasting damage. So we don't know what the shape of the economy is going to look like, or the shape of the recovery. There's a bunch of different possible futures here. So if as part of the recovery, we're going to think through stimulus, and we see stimulus as being a large portion of this, then so there was a question: is any proportion of the increase in women losing jobs due to unequal childcare demands? Yes, absolutely. We don't really know the extent of this. Economists have not had time to study this, but we have. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. That's actually not entirely true. We've seen in the labor force survey an unusually high number of people who have left their jobs voluntarily. During past recessions is very, very rare. People always leave their jobs voluntarily and go do something else. But during a typical recession, that proportion falls. People get very risk averse. They're like, well, I don't want to quit my job because if I do, I'm not going to be able to find another one. Well, we've seen during this crisis an unusually high proportion of people voluntarily leave, sort of voluntarily in air quotes. You can't see the air quotes I'm making. They've seen people voluntarily leave their jobs, and it's to look after either children or elderly relatives. So yes, that is a part of what's going on here. It's largely a sectoral story, but it's not totally a sectoral story. There's absolutely a component of unequal distribution of family responsibilities. We have some indication of the extent of that through data in the labor force survey, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done by policy analysts, by economists to really fully understand the extent of that. But that's absolutely true. And I'm happy to be living that firsthand. So as we go into the recovery, that we believe that the part of the recovery policies are going to have a stimulus focus to it. That there's some lasting economic damage here that's not going to be recovered. So how do we fix that? Well, typically speaking, economists talk about stimulus in terms of three T's. First of all, it has to be timely. That our policies need to jumpstart the economy in a fairly timely manner. It needs to be targeted. We need to be able to identify the sector, the portions of the economy that are hurting, and try and work on addressing those. It needs to be temporary. The idea that it's this Keynesian idea of priming the pump. The idea is that you just get the economy up and functioning again, and then let those market forces take over. And then finally, it's not one of the three T's, but it also has to be implementable. The thing just has to work. So I'm going to talk about this targeted for a second. So again, if we go back to Keynes, Keynes, I'm actually not even sure. No, he did use this term. So he did use the term of idle resources. But the idea behind stimulus policy is that during a recession, there ends up being a bunch of resources, the term resources used broadly, that are sitting on the sidelines. And if they continue to sit on the sidelines, they essentially decay. They fall out of use. They have a half-life to them. So one of the rules of policy is to figure out how to get those resources re-engaged to the economy. And in the framework, John and I talk about how there's four big buckets of resources we can think of trying to re-engage in the economy. First is money, particularly what we call dead money. And we've heard a lot about that after the financial crisis. Mark Carney at the Bank of Canada talked a lot about re-engaging dead money. We have to think about labor, who's lost their jobs, how can we get them back in the economy? Land and buildings, and equipment. So if we think of money, that's going to be a big role for any policymaker is to figure out how we can stimulate the economy and how we can create long-run economic growth, not just by spending taxpayer dollars, that will be a portion of it, but what are the policy instruments needed, the sticks and carrots, in order to get money off of the sidelines to create the conditions for investment. Because we know if we don't, again, looking at past recessions, that money is just going to sit on the sidelines idle. When we look at labor, again, we need to focus on who has lost their job. And as this graph shows, that is primarily in service industries. As a percentage of, if you look at the percentage of workers who have lost their job in every single sector, we look at accommodation and food services, it's close to half. So these are the people we need to re-engage. Again, as I mentioned, it's mostly women. Affected demographic is women under 25. As was pointed out in the chat, a big portion of this is childcare responsibilities or responsibilities looking after elderly relatives. So we're going to need to figure out how to address that bottleneck. We know that in any recession, there's a large reduction in hiring, particularly of new graduates, and this tends to have a scarring effect on their career. That people who graduate during a recession have lower lifetime earnings than people who don't. So how can we get all of those university and college graduates working as quickly as possible to develop their skills, to utilize their skills, to make those connections? And then there's going to be a bunch of different industries that are going to see excess labor. Oil and gas is likely one of them, but there's going to be a bunch of others. Big one is going to be land and real estate. There's going to be a lot of shuttered up shops, a lot of Main Street retail storefronts. We've seen the growth or the percentage of retail sales done by online double in the last 8 weeks. We basically had 8 years worth of growth in online shopping occur in 8 weeks. So we're going to have a lot of brick and mortar stores closed. We're going to have a lot of restaurants that don't come back. We saw just today that Shopify said that they're moving to an entirely virtual work model. There's going to be reduced demand for office space. So there's going to be a lot of land and buildings out there, particularly Main Street ones. What can policy do? Is there a role for policy to help turn some of those brick and mortar locations into things like green social housing or other things? What are the what's the option set, and what are the policy instruments to get you there? There's huge changes coming to manufacturing. Part of that's due to a slowdown in consumer spending, but part of it is just an unwinding of supply chains. That coming out of this crisis, there was a recognition that some of these supply chains just got too complicated, which reduces their resilience. And so we're seeing a lot of onshoring of manufacturing, but that might not necessarily benefit Canada. There might be a lot of protectionism. Canada has a primarily export-based economy. So if we get in the situation where countries are starting to want to put everything within their borders, that might not be a net benefit to us. And as well, we have a lot of trends in the global economy, decarbonization, digitization, and so on. We have to keep our eye on long-run growth. We have to keep an eye on keeping Canada competitive. We can't just focus on the next 12 to 18 months and how to get people back to work, but we also need to realize that we're going to have to restructure our economy in order to use these trends in the global economy to make Canada competitive, right? How can Canada compete in a global economy that's becoming more digital? How can Canada compete in a global economy where countries around the world are trying to figure out how to decarbonize? So with that, and there's, sorry, two more. And then I'm going to pass it along to my colleague, John. Equity is the forefront of this crisis. We cannot forget that this crisis is hitting vulnerable and marginalized populations harder than others. It's hitting women harder than men. It's hitting low-income workers harder than high-income workers. It's affecting First Nations. We need to keep an eye on that. We need to keep an equity lens on everything that we do, because we don't just want to help certain portions of the economy at the cost of greater inequality or greater disparities in opportunity between rich and poor, men and women, and so on. And obviously, being smart prosperity, we recognize that you need to focus on environmental factors. We're trying to hit a climate target for 2030. We're trying to hit a net zero emissions target by 2050. We have all kinds of other domestic environmental targets, clean water, and so on. We need to keep all of those in mind so we can have a green recovery, and not one that pushes us farther away from our environmental targets. So with that, I will pass this along to John McNally.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Hi, folks. My name is John McNally. I'm a research associate here at Smart Prosperity. So as Mike noted, one of the key considerations that we need to think about when assessing stimulus measures as it relates to recovery is that the best recovery principles are going to have to meet sort of tests that we can bring up in three different categories. One is this idea that it is timely, targeted, standard economic stimulus measures. The other is the focus that it also offers long-run benefits, long-run growth, lasting benefits. It offers sort of spurs for innovation. It increases the resilience of our economy. And the third tier is kind of that climate, environment, equity piece. Now, ultimately, Mike, if you wouldn't mind just going to the next slide for me. So ultimately, when we think about supporting a resilient recovery, we need to think through how the ways in which we act in the short term can support the long term, in the sense it can support sort of our long-term competitiveness, and it can focus on rebuilding to have the kind of economy we want in the coming decades. The argument largely being that coming out of this crisis, governments will likely be financially strapped for cash for the better part of a decade. There'll be a need to invest in different things, potentially a need to pay down the deficit, which could happen through things like higher taxes, and there'll be less available cash to spend in these areas. So it's important to think through what kind of investments we need to make in stimulating recovery, because traditionally, the environment and equity issues and kind of long-run competitiveness get shortchanged in a recovery. One of the stats that we like to bring up is that in the 2008-2009 crisis, emissions dipped globally by 2.1%. But in 2010, emissions rose by over 6%. The idea being that the economic rebound that occurred, mostly put aside environmental considerations in favor of short-term growth. And as I'll detail in some of the climate smart pieces of this framework, if we do that this time around, we increasingly have to acknowledge that we will be largely eliminating any possibility that we have to meet our national climate change targets if we double down on carbon-intensive industries. So with all of these considerations in mind, we present to you the Smart Stimulus or Resilient Recovery Framework. Now, the aim of this framework is to assess the feasibility of a given stimulus measure to support a resilient recovery for Canada. And I'm going to walk through each of these questions here and sort of outline some of these considerations. But broadly speaking, there are three lenses that we're using to assess measures. The first is, does it help the economy? The second is, does it help the environment? Does it support clean competitiveness? And the third one is how we differentiate between good ideas and smart stimulus. We have to think through what the equity impacts of a given measure are. We have to think through how feasible it is that we could actually implement something. And we have to think through what it means to implement it. Are there barriers that stand in the way of this policy being successful? And I'm going to walk through some of these in detail. Essentially, our framework outlines the context of why all of this matters, notes some of the key policy challenges, and which criteria and sub-questions are important to consider when trying to answer all of these questions. This webinar is going to focus mostly on understanding the high-level context and how each of these questions and components should be looked at in this particular crisis. So let's start with the first question. Is it timely? So timing for stimulus isn't just about getting money out the door quickly. It's also about how fast a given measure can generate economic impact. Now that makes it a bit more complicated. A policy instrument like a tax credit can get out the door pretty quickly, but if no one has the income or cash to make an investment in the first place that they can later claim, then that may not be the most effective instrument for boosting output through stimulus. So essentially, it's really about making sure that the kind of supports we give out can really generate the kind of activity we need, where we need it, and when we need it, which frankly is kind of as soon as possible, within anywhere from 6 to 18 months. Timing in this context is also about making sure we don't move too fast. So as Mike noted, we have an op-ed coming out next week that sort of details what this middle period is going to be. So you can think of it like the crisis was the short-term impacts of COVID. We're discussing sort of the recovery, which is the long-run impacts. And in between that, we have to sort of climb over a series of mountains to make sure that we're able to get to a recovery intact. And in that period, we're going to need to avoid stimulating demand at a level that doesn't correspond with the public health restrictions or the social distancing guidelines that we have in place in any given time. So we're going to need to think through kind of a Goldilocks approach. We need to make sure that we get it just right when we're thinking about generating activity. And the final point I'll note for this is there was a high-profile report that came out last week by Joseph Stiglitz and Nicholas Stern out of the UK. And it found that a key challenge for any stimulus measures that get put forward is going to be balancing the need to be timely and green. Since a lot of the support that's come out in recessions in the past has found that sort of the greener the stimulus measure, the less timely it is. Now, there are some key exceptions to that, but it is true that making investments in things like research and development tends to create jobs in the long run, not necessarily in the short run. So in that case, we have to think through picking the right policies that are going to support the adoption of market-ready solutions, which is something we have to be very focused on in a stimulus context. So the second piece here is making sure that any stimulus we put out is targeted. And as Mike noted, targeting is about making sure that we identify the idle resources that are in the economy, the resources that are sitting on the sidelines and not doing anything that we can re-engage productively. But equally importantly, it's about thinking through net job creation and net investment. And so when we find ways to re-engage resources, if construction, so I'll play out an example to explain what I mean. In construction and manufacturing, if we put a lot of stimulus dollars towards large infrastructure projects, towards supporting manufacturing, and there is not a large volume of construction workers or manufacturing workers who happen to be unemployed, then stimulus risks not creating new jobs, but rather simply shifting jobs around. And the issue that we run into there is that when jobs are simply shifted, it doesn't necessarily support economic growth overall because it doesn't grow the labor force. So it's important to think through how the kinds of jobs we create and the kinds of investments we make target the people that are currently unemployed. And that means understanding, are there workers available with the skills needed to support building this kind of project? And as Mike also noted, in Canada, we're primarily an export economy for most of what we build. So how stimulus supports job creation has to focus on whether or not the majority of the benefits from the jobs we create are going to occur within Canada's borders or elsewhere. And that's where we can start to have conversations around building out investments kind of throughout the value chain, throughout supply chains for a lot of the industries that we have. So the final piece here on the economic front kind of aims to integrate some of that long-term thinking here. And that's that we want to make sure that the benefits that accrue from these investments are lasting. So there are two ways that you can grow the economy. You can increase the size of the labor force, or you can increase the productivity of the resources that are already in the economy. And what we have a chance to do today is create jobs in the short run, building the infrastructure and systems that are going to improve our productivity over the long term. So it's thinking about how we can sort of grow the economy today by growing the economy of tomorrow. And making sure that we pick sort of the right investments, making sure that we focus on these areas has a chance to support lasting benefits. And importantly, when we say lasting benefits, that can take a few different forms. It can support competitiveness in sectors that have favorable growth prospects, so sectors that are heading in a lower carbon or more digital direction. It can support resilience to future crises from things like future pandemics or natural disasters arising from climate change. Or it can support greater wealth creation within Canada's borders by growing Canadian companies. And one of the big considerations here is finding the need to balance timely and targeted with some of the investments, along with sort of offering some of these lasting benefits. And that'll become important in the kind of policies that we want to put forward and the kinds of initiatives that the government decides to adopt. So moving on to theme 2, which is this broad environmental umbrella. The first question that we want to think through is whether or not a measure supports, whether or not a measure is climate smart, whether or not a measure supports Canada's fight against climate change and helping us meet our climate targets. Now, when thinking through the kinds of targets that we meet, there's a big difference between meeting a 2030 target and meeting a net zero 2050 target. And meeting short-term targets requires getting more reductions out of existing infrastructure. But a lot of the infrastructure that we might use in 2030 might not necessarily fit in a net zero world. So we have to also think through making investments in longer term infrastructure that is going to be around for 30 years, while balancing the idea that not all of that technology is market ready to be deployed today. So if we make a lot of investments in net zero technologies, not all of those investments have the capacity to create jobs in a way that is timely. And the key here will be balancing what kinds of investments and what kinds of measures we put forward to meet both targets so that we avoid funding future stranded assets. And another important point to remember is that stimulus does not replace policy in this context. So when we're talking about fighting climate change, stimulus is not a replacement for carbon pricing or for regulations. You can think of stimulus like a giant one-time public investment in infrastructure, whereas policy is long-term sustained investment from the entire market towards a lower carbon objective. So it's the idea of sort of a carrots and sticks approach, with the carrot being supported by some of these stimulus investments. And whether or not the stimulus you put forward can support meeting a climate target and maybe even accelerate progress towards it, or completely undermine whether or not you achieve a climate target, really depends on the kinds of investments that get made. So the second theme here is to ensure that any stimulus investments are green. So supporting green investments doesn't just mean supporting the fight against climate change. Any stimulus measure that supports sort of any government of potential co-benefits that can come from any of these measures. And those can come in the form of, public health benefits from improved air quality, or benefits to communities from increasing the amount of green space. And those can be beneficial in their own right. But it's important to note that not every single measure is going to be complementary. So there are potentially trade-offs here. Supporting cleaner power could, in some cases, mean potentially negatively impacting goals towards nature conservation or biodiversity. And the key here is going to be finding ways to balance outcomes in a broader stimulus package, right? There is room for measures that support all sorts of environmental objectives here. So in a broader package that gets put forward, it's going to be important to understand which measures you want to support and which ones might not make sense. So the final point here is supporting clean innovation. And this is obviously a specialty of smart prosperities. So stimulus can be really effective at supporting clean innovation throughout the innovation cycle, everywhere from inventing clean technology to adopting clean technology. And clean technology, I want to clarify here, it isn't just lower carbon technology, it's also technologies and solutions that support the circular economy and more efficient use of resources. So in a stimulus context, the major theme here is supporting deployment and adoption of technologies, since the productivity benefits that the economy receives are largest when a new technology is deployed and adopted at scale. right? The more people use it, the more productive the processes are, the higher the benefits for everyone overall. So when we talk about technology in a stimulus context, we want to be sure that we're emphasizing the importance of actually using clean technology, actually making sure that it gets in the hands of businesses and households. And the easiest way to do that is for stimulus to support pushing mature technologies into the market, or financing to make sure clean technology gets into the market. And that's what we mean by the second point, which is that not every clean technology is a great fit for stimulus right now. And we say that because not every clean technology happens to be completely market ready. Now, for the ones that aren't, there are lots of opportunities, and I wrote an article about this that got published last week. There are lots of opportunities for promising clean technologies to be supported through pilot or demonstration programs. But it's important to understand that different technologies sit at different levels of market readiness, and getting the right support to the right kind of technology is what's going to drive private sector investment in that solution in the next 5 years. So policy needs to be very cognizant and very aware of where technologies sit on their relative cost curves. So finally, this last section, again, focuses on taking the ideas that might be good ideas for sort of the economy and the environment and turning them into smart stimulus measures. So this first point is equity. So as Mike noted, equity is at the forefront of this crisis. Vulnerable and marginalized populations are always hit hardest in any crisis. And it's important to note that right now, they're caught in the midst of two different crises simultaneously. One is the health crisis from COVID, and two is the economic crisis from the shutdown. And each of those have a bit of a feedback loop. A health crisis forces companies and individuals to deplete their financial reserves and increases layoff rates. And the economic crisis has negative long-term health impacts for similar reasons. So one of the points that I've heard mentioned a few times, and that I really want to kind of hammer home here, is that women and vulnerable populations have been unemployed at higher rates than virtually anyone else in the scope of this crisis. And they already faced systemic barriers to entry into the workforce. And if stimulus wants to genuinely get the economy back on its feet in the scope of the next 5 years, there is a strong possibility that it is not mathematically possible to resurrect the economy without directly addressing these systemic barriers to workforce participation faced by women, Indigenous communities, and vulnerable and marginalized communities across Canada. So stimulus really needs to think through the accessibility piece. How can we make workforce participation more accessible for these populations? How can we lower the barriers to workforce participation? And how can we make sure that the jobs we create are high quality jobs? Because remember, one of the key themes here is supporting a resilient recovery. And a resilient recovery is a robust one. It's one that's lasting. And a massive short-term boost in part-time employment won't necessarily have the same kinds of productivity benefits and spillover benefits from increased consumer spending that would come from really focusing on high-quality jobs. And in these areas, social supports like affordable childcare that's universal, and as Mike noted, affordable housing would have substantial benefits in lowering the barriers to participation and supporting accessibility. So from putting the equity component of the equity conversation aside, which is an absurd thing to say, but focusing purely on the macroeconomics of this, that would be a substantially powerful stimulus measure. And it's an important thing to remember when you think about who's been hit hardest by this particular crisis. So when we think through this feasible question, we've mentioned this a few times, I think, but the way that stimulus is distributed is going to influence the pace of recovery more than usual. And there's two reasons for that. One is that the impacts of this crisis have been more distributed than usual. It's not simply a case of issuing funding to a small number of shovel-ready infrastructure projects anymore. The initiatives that have been taken on by the federal government have been about getting money to small businesses and households that number in the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. And because the number of recipients here has increased by an order of magnitude, the design choices that we're going to pick in the kinds of instruments we want to deploy matter far more. And whether a particular infrastructure project is debt or equity or grant finance, it matters, but not nearly as much as when you're talking about getting money to that many more recipients, because the small design choices are going to be magnified and they're going to matter a lot more when they're deployed at that scale. So when we think this one through, we may need to create, or we may need to partner with non-federal institutions or create different institutions to be able to get money out to the scale that it's been needed. The federal government has already shown through some of the support programs so far that they're willing to partner with commercial banks. And it could be that in order to continue getting money out to households and businesses, that's a model that ends up continuing to make sense from a policy perspective. And the other important piece to note here is that different demographics are going to have different concerns. So small businesses are going to face cash gaps that need to be plugged. And in this case, something like a loan or a tax incentive may not be as effective as issuing a direct grant if you want businesses to stay afloat or if you want them to make new investments. And there are a lot of reasons for this that sort of get into debt rates on corporate balance sheets, and we're not going to dive too deep into that. But one of the kind of big consideration that I would hope that you guys walk away with here is the idea that the kinds of demographics that are affected mean that there are some kinds of financing models and there are some kinds of delivery models for the kinds of money that we want to put out that are simply going to be more effective at restarting the economy. So the final piece here talks about whether or not a measure is implementable. So if market or policy or regulatory barriers to something succeeding are not overcome, they're going to dramatically impact the uptake of a particular stimulus measure. Market and policy barriers can take a range of forms. They can be a result of organic market activity, or they can be strategically put up by firms, or they can be sort of red tape that serves a particular purpose, but that ultimately does hold back investment in a particular area. And the example that I'll put forward, because again, Smart Prosperity is more familiar with this, are the barriers to clean innovation, which are particularly high in some of these areas. And those matter a lot in the context of smart stimulus. So thinking through the kinds of policy and regulatory barriers that we know exist, and the ways that they can be overcome is going to be important in this context. And the final point that I'll make here is that we need to be realistic about what we can control. As Mike noted, and as I've heard mentioned by a few people, Canada is primarily an export-based economy. There are ongoing global trends that we need to be aware of, and those are going to impact our economy in the coming decade. So we need to think through what are the things that we can control, and what are the areas in which we can set ourselves up for success to at least reduce the risk that comes from the global trends potentially negatively affecting us. And that, as much as anything else, is about positioning us for success over the long run. So for this framework, as Mike noted, we've officially launched it, and we've submitted it to the Task Force for Resilient Recovery as sort of the assessment framework that they might want to use and think through when they're assessing specific stimulus measures. Right now, we're currently in kind of what we call a peer review process. So we view this smart stimulus or resilient recovery framework as a living assessment tool. And we're collaborating with a number of experts right now to refine the framework in the coming weeks to make sure that we can not only plug the gaps that exist, but we can think through areas in which it could be strengthened or substantiated. And also, the more data that's released about the economic impacts and the impacts of this crisis, as those become clearer, we will continue to adapt and tailor this existing framework to making sure that we're including the right factors and the right criteria to support a post-COVID recovery. And Mike, I'll just throw it back to you to wrap up.
Sorry about that. I was having trouble unmuting my microphone. So thank you, John, for that overview of the framework. As John points out, we see this as a living document. So we would love to hear from you. You have our contact information. So as you go through the document, if you do decide to go through the document, if you have any questions, have any ideas, please contact us. We'd love to hear from you. This is uncharted times. I mean, we haven't seen anything like this in over 100 years. There's no playbook out there on how to deal with a situation like this from both a public health and and an economic point of view. So yeah, we would love to hear from you. So yeah, I just lost my train of thought. So we'd love to hear from you. So please please contact us with your questions and suggestions. So thank you everyone for attending. This has been we had a surprisingly large audience for this. We will be sharing. We will be sharing this this webinar. We'll be posting it shortly, so you will be able to go back and review. I've seen some questions on that. So yes, it is possible to get a recording. We will be posting that. So thank you everyone for attending, and again, I look forward to hearing from you. Take care.